manos mi vida, era él o era yo. Expedientes y más expedientes, con mi nombre y el de otras mujeres que esquivamos con
I hope everyone can hear me well, and thank you for the introductions happening in the chat. Please keep it coming. I was telling you a little bit about Making Change Happen, and that this dialogue is the launch of the 7th in the series. And this Making Change Happen really is to allow us to put out some of the things we are thinking about that shape social justice and women's rights work. These are things that we do in collaboration with our partners. Each edition takes on a different theme. And if you haven't seen them, please go onto our website to look at them. And we've had previous editions, for example, one that looked at Indigenous and rural women in defense of land and territories. We've had one that looked at citizen engagement and global economic power. And we've had one that looked at power movements change in Malawi. This particular one really tries to delve into the complex relationship between feminist movement building and elections. It collected and analyzed the experiences of JASS and some of its partners in organizing around elections. And we tried to look at some key questions. Should we engage with elections? Why should we engage with elections? How should we engage with elections? And we looked at the different ways women's organizations relate to electoral processes and the potential pitfalls and progress and pros and cons. This issue draws from JASS's experiences in all 3 of our areas, geographical areas where we work. We have people from today here with us from Southeast Asia, Mesoamerica and Southern Africa, which where I'm from, that will share their experiences and their insights with us. And this particular edition is garnering experiences and research spanning roughly 2020 to 2025. So I wanted to also emphasize that for JASS, collective protection and civic space is a key global agenda. And we know that when we challenge the status quo, we face severe backlash. And therefore, for us, it's important to really, in a robust way, explore the place of elections in our analysis and strategies to defend, to protect, and to advance collective protection and civic space. So this dialogue will consist of 3 parts today. We have roughly 90 minutes together. Part 1 of the dialogue will present some of the findings of research of women's organizing in electoral context with reflections from JASS members from the 3 regions. So that will be part 1. Part 2 of the webinar, we open up the discussion on why and how movements organize in elections among our allies, and they will bring in some of their own experiences and reflections to enrich our thinking today. And the last part, part 3, will allow for another round of engagement with all our panelists and contributors, as well as obviously engaging with your questions and comments. And so we are really looking forward to spending this time with you today. And I'm really honored to be first on. I will be moderating part 1 of this dialogue. And I think we should just dive right in because you are here to hear these rich insights from the people who are sharing with us today. Before I start, just to also tell you to please that the bios of all the panelists will be shared in the chat. So I will not be reading that out today. So in this session, we will hear from JASS members based in Zimbabwe, Guatemala, and the Philippines, where women's movements have chosen to engage with elections in many different ways. But before we get to them, let's first hear from Laura Carlson. She is JASS's coordinator of knowledge and the lead author for this edition of Making Change Happen. She will be speaking in English. Laura, it will be so wonderful to hear from you. If you can tell us a little bit about why is this publication so timely, and what are some of the most important insights we should hold today? You have 4 minutes.
Thanks so much, Viv. You know, when we started this, as you mentioned, in 2020, it was during COVID, and it was part of a series of dialogues called Women Radically Transforming a World in Crisis. We had no idea back then that in 2025, we were going to be facing a different kind of a crisis with rising authoritarianism and an erosion in public trust in democracy itself and also in elections. For one reason, because there's so much electoral fraud, there's the influence of hidden and invisible powers such as corporate strength and the media and the disenfranchisement, the active disenfranchisement of many excluded sectors of the population. Then we were also seeing that people were actually electing authoritarian governments. They were basically choosing to relinquish democratic freedoms for false promises of security in most cases. So with this increase in the right-wing power that attacks women's rights in particular and their autonomy using anti-gender policies as a pillar of their political platforms that end up going beyond the electoral sphere, we realized it was a good time to do this. So there are essentially two premises that we discovered. One is context. This is not a yes or no question of ideologically, do you participate in elections or don't you? All the organizations were taking into account a careful analysis of timing, context, political context, power relations, where they are, risk, the possibilities of gains, and also the possibilities to avoid negative outcomes. What we focused on then was identifying criteria for how to participate in electoral processes. And then the second, of course, was strategy, that participating around elections has to be part of a larger strategy, and it can never be abandoned, that the movement building has to remain autonomous and strong throughout that process. There were limited expectations for electoral outcomes, but the expectations were centered in strengthening the movements. So the major findings, Viv, were that organizing elections actually works for strengthening movements, as long as there's context and strategy. In opener societies, you can create channels for influence, and you can create allies. And in more closed societies, sometimes you can fend off threats. Feminist popular education was always a part of these. There was education on democracy and women's rights. There was also education that taught the limits of elections themselves and why. We saw this in the platform of demands that we'll hear about later in Zimbabwe, Indonesia, the Philippines. It brought groups together to consolidate women's demands and also managed in many cases to expand grassroots organizations as more people began to see the specific demands that were being presented there. So ironically, you had elections, kind of a superficial definition of democracy, in many cases refocusing on structural change, because part of that education was, it's not the who of the candidates that the electoral process normally focuses on, but the what. You know, while the system was focused on the personalities, the power analyses were focused on how power moves. What and whose interests do candidates represent? What systems do they promote? What structural architecture of power and wealth is behind their promises and their actions to the populace? So the publication concludes actually without a conclusion, but with a promise. And that's to continue to reflect on these issues collectively, to open up forums for dialogue and education and building solidarity in hostile times, and to help strengthen the women's organizations and the movements in the strategies that each one of them defines for itself. This webinar is another step on that path.
Thank you for that, Laura. Introducing our next panelist, and that's Watsanai. She is the JASS country coordinator based in Zimbabwe, and she will also be speaking in English. Watsanai, you've heard Laura speak about how elections and feminist movements participating in elections, that it's not a one size fits all. but that there are ways that women find to make it meaningful, and it's often linked to that there are bigger processes of movement building, that it's not an end in itself, right? So how has your organizing in these electoral cycles in Zimbabwe changed or strengthened women's collective power? Watsana, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Viv, and hello to everyone on the call. And yeah, so just to put in a bit of context, Laura spoke of how context is as a key factor when we look around elections and movement strategy. So for us in Zimbabwe, in the southern part of Africa, we have elections every 5 years. And our last election was in 2023. And just to also highlight that our elections are what we have called harmonized, and technically just meaning that we have our municipal election together with elections for our members of parliament, together with the election for the president. So we have like 3 elections all in one one day. So when we go to vote, we vote for all these 3 positions. And because of our system, we also have the upper house of parliament being voted in by a pro rata system. So women's organizing, Viv, is ongoing. It doesn't stop. Women organize every day. So whether we are in an election, an election moment or not, whether it's before, during, or after the electoral cycle, women are consistently organizing. And one thing that we've noted in Zimbabwe as women were organizing was how then could we make use of the electoral cycle, and together with our partners, we had a process, and women came up with what they've called What Women Want. And the What Women Want campaign is a platform that women in Zimbabwe organized themselves around and laid out their 10 demands. And these demands are demands for decent, safe lives, things to do with security of women, their safety and security in the country, and in processes, their opportunity to participate in electoral processes, in governance and decision making, the basic things of access to clean potable water, shelter, and things of this nature. And as we look at, and as we looked at women's participation, one thing that came out was, as women were organizing, the electoral moment is a moment that women then chose to engage with. And the What Women Want became a platform to do this engagement, to lay out demands that are neither necessarily for this political party or that one, but the demands that women are laying on the electoral moment, and wanting to get that out of it. Other women have chosen, like you say, Laura, that it's neither this or that. Others chose not to engage with the process totally, given that the outcomes, and being able to take score of the outcomes and say, what have we gotten over the years? At times it's difficult to pull that out. But women continue to organize around the election moment. And as they organize around the election moment, the intention is, how do we make use of this moment as part of the bigger strategy to be able to secure their demands? So we have, and we still continue as women in Zimbabwe, and together with our partners, to work around the election moment, to lay out these demands to election candidates, and to also field women candidates who can also occupy these positions, and hopefully with them being there, take advantage of that and see whatever shifts and changes. But it is an ongoing process, Viv. It is part of the movement strategy by women across the country to be able to push and to secure their own demands and their own needs and get their struggles addressed. So allow me to end at that, Viv.
Thank you very much, Watsa. It was really great to hear your contributions from Zimbabwe, but I'll keep moving us along with your permission. But let's move on, and let me introduce to you our JASS country coordinator based in the Philippines. Justine, you are welcome. Justine will be speaking to us in English today. Justine, in Southeast Asia, there seemed to be this alarming trend with elections bringing in anti-rights regimes into power. So in this context in the region of this rising authoritarianism and the risk of elections legitimizing anti-democratic setbacks, please tell us a little bit about how and why women have organized around elections under these contexts.
Yes, thanks, Viv. Yeah, I'd like to echo what you mentioned around increasingly authoritarian regimes across Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and in Cambodia, in Thailand, and especially in Myanmar at the moment. Yeah, there is violence, and especially during elections and around the time of elections. But I'd like to highlight also what Watson and I mentioned, that women organize every day, elections or not. Women, as part of a bigger people's movement, organize every day, continue a political education every day, organize to raise their demands, to strengthen their leadership, and to express dissent and to challenge these authoritarian regimes in different ways. It may look differently in Indonesia and the Philippines, and in Cambodia, Thailand, and in Myanmar. But yeah, I think that's an important point to highlight. And the question on why continue organizing around elections, yeah, it's also because, like what you've mentioned, women women's organizations, and women's movements across these countries do not see elections as an endpoint to uh or an end all be all to uh strengthening and building power. It's an approach or a mechanism or an avenue, an opportunity to organize, to strengthen their organizations, to expand their movements, to build stronger alliances across sectors, labor, from the labor sector to the um indigenous peoples organizations, uh to farmers, and or urban and rural women organizations. uh so it's a space to raise their demands, like what Watson and I mentioned around what women want. Indonesia and the Philippines also have a um similar set of agenda. In the Philippines, we call it Women Want Change, and each of the letters of change respond to a corresponding demand. And Indonesia has crafted the 10-point women's agenda through the We Lead consortium in the last 5 years, also similar uh to the time frame you've mentioned earlier. And these agendas came from political discussions, feminist popular education spaces, where they center their voices, their experiences, their stories in crafting the agenda and pinpointing what they want, what they want to highlight. And this uh, this 10-point agenda, or these sets of demands, have become a a way to first lobby to different local and um national candidates. But also, more than that, it's a way to organize, to organize around these sets of demands, to build stronger alliances beyond the elections. It's stepping stone also for a broader, more transformative change that we are demanding. So yeah, I think that is for Southeast Asian context. And I think there are a lot of similarities with across the three regions where we are in, and especially in the global south. So yeah, I think that's it for now.
Thank you so much, Justine. And I would like to now hand over to Laura, who will be moderating the second section, where you will be able to hear even more from some of our partners and their insights on feminism, movement building, and elections. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Vivian. It's really a pleasure to be here and to see all of you here. As promised, this is a continuation of our efforts to broaden the dialogue on democracy in elections, which we know are taking place not only in JASS, but also in almost all of our allied organizations and the social organizations and women's movements that we work with. So we hope that this space will continue. Now, on this part of the panel, what we're going to do is we are going to broaden that out, and we've invited 4 people on this incredible panel from allied organizations to not so much comment directly on the publication, but to talk about their own experiences and reflections on democracy and building movements in the context of elections. So this is a panel of practitioners to share their work and receive strategic provocations, some questions that will help us to delve deeper into some of these issues. We're going to start out with Ana Inés Abelenda. Ana is a lead organizer for NOOR, an international network that works on opposing far-right agendas and advancing feminist transformative visions. Ana, welcome to the panel. So glad you could be with us. Ana, one of our findings is that more movements are getting involved around elections specifically to counter far-right threats. What have you learned regarding how to use elections to organize to block the kind of anti-gender authoritarian projects that we're seeing in so many parts of the world now?
Thank you for having invited me and for sharing JASS's publication, which was so interesting, and also the exercise that you carried out to systematize the experiences of feminist movements in the context of elections. From NOOR, we particularly focus on contexts where the extreme right and religious fundamentalism have a presence, a very strong presence, and where they have a strong impact in terms of what they've being able to win elections and also their existence in movements. In the 4 minutes I have, I would like to talk a little bit about this, what you mentioned in terms of electoral process as such are just one leg of the democratic participation, because this is a longer process in the that includes influencing on partisan politics and building alliances. And also there's something in the publication that I think was extremely important that we're also looking at from our network and the different conversations that we've carried out, particularly most recently in the AWID forum. And that winning or losing an election in itself is not the ultimate objective, but we have to recognize there's been very significant turning towards the right. And this is important because that makes elections important in terms of the opportunity to break this process, to slow down this process, which may be carrying on for decades. Because in a systematic fashion, it's been going on in terms of violence, the violence that has been increasing, and also the narration that's quite apolitical, that in terms of the strengthening of capitalism and that and indicating that politics are not been able to, the current politics have not been able to resolve this situation. So winning an election can have an impact in terms of the context in which we can carry out our feminist vision. For example, if you decide whether or not you decide to participate in partisan politics, we have to remember that politics is a way to perhaps break these global, or to stop these global cycles we've seen carrying on. The second point I wanted to bring is that this is also a time for building alliances that may have been unexpected or unforeseen. We've seen that in Argentina now with the election last Sunday, where they were able to put a break, particularly in the capital's province, to the far right as represented by the president's party. And there have been groups that have been able to say the political and economic project of the right in Argentina has most effectively that they have to bring together the different and varied fights. Also, the dialogues that we carried out prior to that, for example, women from Kenya and Bangladesh were telling us about the importance of organizing to build alliances with movements that may not be well organized. And for example, the student movements, they have been key in terms of mobilizing mass protest. And some context in which the religion and the church has a strong presence, including Brazil, also alliances with less conservative religious sectors have been important. All of these alliances that are built over years, and they're part of a political construction with the capacity to visualize by working shoulder to shoulder with persons that may have been unforeseen and groups that may have been unforeseen. And the other point is the importance of advocacy work at a local level even. So even sometimes we can't achieve things immediately at a national level, but we can locally. And so I know that JASS and many of the organizations here form parts of these networks because it's important working with the media, and the importance of actions even at a local scale is very important. We see some, particularly in the cases of disinformation and hate that can be backed up with fact checking, they're important, but just wanted to stress the importance of this local work. And let me conclude by saying that these dialogues are so important to be able to think more the long term. What is what we want to achieve? That it's because it's not limited to the electoral process. We know within feminist and women's movements, we know that the state and democracy need to be redefined in a systemic fashion, but the participation in these processes is an opportunity to think about the levels of participation in democracy that we want. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anna. And I think we're going to get back to that last point in the next round of questions. Also taking into account that we've been talking about using elections to build the movements, but that sometimes it really is important to win. And we've seen that with the election of Donald Trump or a Javier Milei. And it's good that you mentioned as well that they can be used to then again limit the power of some of those authoritarian leaders that have been brought into power. So we want to really remind people that the full bios of the people who will be speaking can be found in the chat. And we really encourage you to go ahead and put your comments and your questions in so that we can get to them at the end. The next speaker is Sandra Moran. She's a feminist lesbian movement builder who served in the Guatemalan Congress and has seen the dynamics of state power from the inside and the outside. Sandra and JASS, we often use a quote of yours about the disputed territories where movements must engage to advance, and these include contention for power in the realm of bodies, land, nature, memory, history, cosmovision, and then you added the state. Today, why do you believe it's necessary for movements to dedicate energy and resources to contending for power, for state power?
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. That's what I've heard for today. I ratify that the state is indeed a territory in dispute. Through the use of the state as a tool, the system and corporations have been able to take away our territories. They've been able to take away our rights. They've been able to attack us. Today in Guatemala, those who led the mobilizations of between in 2023 are being persecuted and are in jail. And now the state is a tool can be used as an instrument to solve those problems. In the case of movements, I think that today we're in a process in the context of the 2027 elections, and will be an experience to an opportunity to build alliances, and it will be is an opportunity to fight for both the power and common sense, and because elections are a time when people are listening. And so it's time to be able to make new proposals that will be directly related to what the population needs. Of course, it's not just this what we must do, because we're talking about elections in a liberal state, and which is may not be what we aspire to, but it isn't an opportunity to talk about what we do want to build and what we do or do not like or want. And that what we do here in Guatemala with our movement is to build a discussion comparing what we would like to build and what we would like to take away. And so it's not an opportunity not only to build alliances, but also to share what we're dreaming of and what we want to build. So yes, the state continues to be a territory in dispute, and its opportunity to really truly be citizens. And sometimes we talk about movements of organized people, but the truth is the majority of our populations are not organized. But at the times of election is a time when there is a mobilization of the population. So we're talking about a relationship with the citizenry that is not formally organized. It is an opportunity to be able to talk about what we want to, what we aspire to. Is an opportunity for exercise of this democracy, and a political exercise to talk about not only democracy, but what we want to build in participatory democracy in the full sense of the term is what we're talking about. We know Mexico is working on this as well through the current movement, even within the government. But we know we're losing more space, for example, in Bolivia and Ecuador, or with the most advanced constitution in Latin America. What have we had where they were taking power away? And so yes, the state is a territory in dispute, and it's something that we need to sustain and maintain. And that's what's perhaps most difficult.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for those reflections. Again, we'll be going back to many of those. But now I want to go ahead and present Jonathan Fox. Jonathan Fox is the director of the Accountability Research Center at American University. So, Jonathan, Sandra has talked about why dispute state power and about doing that during electoral processes. You've been examining power shifts in governments due to popular pressure. Let's take it a little farther. After partial wins in elections, what's next for movement building strategies?
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for the invitation to join this strategy discussion and for producing your amazing synthesis in 3 languages. And I'll also say, as someone who also does publications, the infographics are particularly cool. So thanks for that. And this question of what's next, it raises a whole series of strategy questions that may be a bit different from the questions of how to engage in elections where the goal is really damage control or tactical coalition building. And it raises the question of what does a win look like? And this is a scenario, as Sandra shared, not only in Guatemala, but here in Colombia. I'm in Colombia right now, in Brazil, in Senegal, in Sri Lanka, in Latin America, some Latin American countries in the past. So what does what I'm calling a post-electoral window of opportunity look like? And that depends on how open the window is. It depends on the composition of the coalition that wins. Often it's a center-left coalition, but who's really in charge? It depends on the backlash that follows, as the Guatemalan People's Movement experienced. And often progressives in these scenarios could win the presidency or the vice presidency, but not necessarily a majority in Congress, not the rest of the state apparatus, not the courts, not the police, not even the attorney general, as in the case of Guatemala. So when is a win a win? And the inherited state apparatus often retains the power to decide whether and how to put nice sounding laws and policies and budgets into practice. So changing people at the top is very different from transforming the state in capital letters. So yes, as Sandra said so eloquently, the state is contested terrain, but what do the transitional steps look like to get from a starting point of some partial electoral victories to actually leading to some deeper transformations? And we might consider the challenges here in Colombia, where I am right now, where Vice President Francia Marquez came up from the ranks as a grassroots rights defender. She's an inspirational hero for feminists and anti-racist and environmental movements, both in Colombia and around the world. And her message of hope and inclusion inspired increased voter turnout in underrepresented groups that helped the left to win both the presidency and the vice presidency in 2022. But since then, she has been very frank and public about the challenge of trying to transform the rest of the state, to get a real handle on the levers of state power. And she's been trying mightily to deliver to her constituencies and to make the kinds of changes that will transform in a tangible way at least parts of the state. She's led the creation of Colombia's new National Ministry of Equality, which then faced huge resistance from the courts, from the legislature, from the mainstream media, and even from within her own governing coalition. And some of her most significant changes within the state may take quite a while to be felt on the ground, like delivering water and sanitation to the Afro-descendant majority cities on Colombia's Pacific coast. And so here's the catch then. By the time she actually manages to, her changes manage to be carried out in practice, her term in office will be over. What does that mean politically? And for how movements interpret the question of who really are our allies and how can we get them to deliver from the state? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Some very interesting questions going deeper into, when is a win a win. But let's go ahead and go on and talk to Maria Matui. Maria is the another ally of JASS and a very important organization in these discussions. She's from the Coalition of Women's Human Rights Defenders in the East and Horn of Africa, and also part of the ESCR network on economic, social, and cultural rights. Maria, do you see elections as an opportunity to advance your particular agenda of women's social, economic, and political rights, especially in closed societies like the ones that you're working on?
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, undoubtedly. I would say that election is a really important process in ensuring that democracy is not seen, heard, but also practiced by all those who are in the society. And I'll speak about the group of women and girls that I'm working with very closely. When we look into democracy and participation in general, and the context that I'm working with, specifically in movements and women and girls from rural to urban peripheries, we see that for past few years, when the global really the conversation has been into multi-party systems, but also the participation and the rule of law, which all that combines the conversation around democracy. Women has been the most big population that drive the agenda of political conversation, but also political election during that particular time. This is from the campaigning, this is from the mobilization, this is from supporting each other, supporting the women who are vying for those positions, but also supporting men who are also vying in those positions. The unfortunate bit that I would say, and this is from my personal experiences from being in the ground and working with the movement, is the capitalization of women who are in movements and who are mobilizing those who are vying for these positions, is the non-recognizance of the role these women play along the way. This is from the mobilization, the campaigning, and even during the election itself. And for us now, and linking with what the other speakers have spoken about, you find that gap, which now, if democracy, which should be for everybody and which is believed to be bridging the communities, the societies into a space where all those groups of people will then see the aspiration of coming into realization, not being participating in full in terms of when the time of voting, certain category of people are able to vote, and those who are voting, their rights then are not seen being implemented in a sense that democratic processes have or tried to ensure their rights will be then being implemented or seen being implemented. And I go further to speaking to the representation of women themselves in these political positions. You find, for the case of where I'm coming from, in majority of the continent of where this is Africa, women are the makes a huge population of our census. This could be above 51, 52, around there, not above 55. But their voices, which contribute to the democratic processes, then becomes silenced when it comes to democratic enjoyment of the rights of these particular groups of people who move the movement of the campaigns, of election processes throughout the process. So as much as truly election and democracy brings about the voices and representation of people, its realization of its democratic processes, that is still far-fetched to be realized in many parts of Africa and maybe part of where I'm coming from. And women are still left behind in a huge part of realization of their voices throughout this process. The only jubilation that women seen and being appreciated is during the campaign and during the building the movement that they can support the campaigners and those who are vying for the positions. So maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Maria. Okay, well, let's start building on some of these issues that have been put on the table here. Let's go back to Anna. And Anna, you were talking at the end about state power and transforming state power.
Mhm.
What are you seeing as the risks and the opportunities of using state power to transform state power?
That's a good question, Laura, and I think it's been key in examples such as the case of Colombia with Francia Marquez that was mentioned earlier, that we said when the state and the structures that come from historical processes in terms of the institutions and even among the leftist politicians, they talk about the transformation of the state, which is something that has been going on for a long time, and but that many of these issues must be addressed systemically. I think if I put it in the context, if I look at Uruguay, I would have seen as a model because there's partisan politics in the state. There's even a feminist party that has long-term or excuse me, not the party, their feminist projects for long term, but we see that where you see on a daily level where the state, it can be used as an apparatus of oppression against the people. We have to understand this context. We go from a holistic perspective to be able to gain power in a state that has historically been used for oppression. It's understandable that the state is not seen as perhaps as a protective structure. And so I think it's important to understand these contexts, but also seeing it from a perspective of historical and long-term perspective. The present, do you think the growth of the right sector is part of a process that's united to capitalism, and it could take decades? It's a transformation that we are viewing in the state we want to see in the future, I think must go hand in hand with thinking in different ways politically, that not thinking exclusively in terms of the state, but rather viewing this as a reform with popular power at the center. I mean, that's in response to your question, and I think it has to do with the context, with the state of the states to which we're referring. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, once again, we get back to context, of course. Okay, well, let's go to Sandra now. And Sandra, I thought it was interesting that you mentioned not only the strengthening of movements in this context of working around elections, but also strengthening the relationship with the citizenry that's not necessarily organized in social organizations and movements, which involves a broader process of creating civic actors. How do you work to generate movement campaigns that can create this broader civic engagement of what in Spanish is called political subjects, or of civic actors in society?
Thank you. We've been thinking about how to create a popular feminist political subject, but as a plural political subject. The experience that we had in 2023 gave us a fundamentally necessary experience. It helped us to see that Guatemala has three types of democracy that coexist. There's representational democracy, which is what we've been talking about, elections that take place every 4 years, political parties, civic committees that don't tend to represent the people's interests, and that creates a state based on neoliberalism, racism, and patriarchy. There's also participatory democracy, where we engage with elected leaders, but that also has its limits based on institutions that come from neoliberalism and corruption, and direct democracy, people's democracy, which has persisted despite colonialism and beyond the past 500 years. And this is the democracy that comes from the people. Now, in terms of democracy of the people, we are building and we want to build a plurinational state. However, this is a process of building power. We refer to ourselves as women with constituent power because we want to remind ourselves of the power that we have. And we focus on how we build networks, movements, and how we weave along with other citizens who are seen as clients or whose votes be bought. And so for the elections in 2027, we want to organize even more people so that through that proposal of building something that responds to people's needs, it will be based on direct democracy, based on assemblies. And on electing people who provide a service, people who give back. We weave together because fighting for power is also a fight for meaning. And neoliberalism has changed the definitions and what was understood by the people and by communities. And so we need to take that back. And even in Guatemala City, we were able to take the narrative back. And so we're building collectively. And Jonathan was saying, well, what was it after you won? Well, this is a permanent and constant process. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sandra, for those reflections. Viv, do you have Rosa there?
Hi, Rosa, can you hear us?
Hello, hola.
Ah, wonderful. I am hoping that you heard some of the reflections from the other panelists. And we have introduced you like 3 times already. So everyone in the room is really waiting to hear from you. And there's been a lot of reflections about elections and how feminist movement, organizations and activists participate or don't participate in different ways in election processes across the three regions. And there's been a question for is to tell us a little bit about how indigenous organizations led this movement that many other parts of civil society joined to defend the election results in 2023 in Guatemala. And if you can take about 4 minutes to respond to that question, that would really be wonderful. Thanks, Rosa. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Liz Rosa. My apologies, I'm having technical difficulties. My comments are connected to what Sandra said. There's the power and democracy that comes from indigenous women. There were 106 days of resistance and mobilization. We were defending democracy and demanding that certain politicians step down who were trying to disregard the electoral results. This was a historic moment that put indigenous movement, indigenous leaders, and indigenous women at the center. People came together from territories all across the country. They mobilized in urban spaces, through public forums, and they put their movements at the center. Some also referred to this as a popular rebellion. Democracy here in the past has been the privilege of just a few people. And they not only fought for a transition in the government, but also for a dignified future for everyone in Guatemala. And we learned a lot from that process. democracy in Guatemala can't continue to ignore indigenous communities. Politics is also built through spirituality and care. During these 106 days, there were narratives that were transformed in the social imaginary. Indigenous people are not only guardians or stewards of the land, but they also have an impact in the entire country. And they are acknowledged as political actors that led a long-lasting and autonomous and sustainable mobilization. And it also motivated the movements in the cities to get organized. The participation of indigenous leaders and indigenous women in the cities was noted by urban sectors. In the past, they've been stigmatized for strikes and manifestations, and they've been seen as a problematic sector. But during these 106 days, that narrative was transformed. Indigenous leaders were present in the city as a reference of leadership, and they were received with respect, both by urban, union, and student movements, and the population in general. And that is a key aspect of collective democracy. Now, the power of this mobilization would not have been possible without the indigenous leaders and indigenous communities. And indigenous leaders are not on the margin. They are political actors, and they can pressure the state. And they can also exert pressure on corporations. And this doesn't mean that structural racism has disappeared, but it did create fractures in the system of exclusion.
We're so glad that we could get you on, and you put a number of important issues into the debate. I want to go to Maria in the little time that we have left. You know, Rosa's talking about the conversion, or not the conversion, but the, say, intensification of the role of Indigenous people and Indigenous women in particular as political actors. Sandra talked about the formation of political actors as well. And you were talking about this challenge of women not being recognized as political actors and the lack of a real democracy that would allow them to be full participants. What are some of the strategies you've seen, Maria, of creating that more permanent character of a political actor within excluded populations, and particularly women?
Thank you, Laura, for the question. So for the period that we've been working, and what I've seen that is is really working is the understanding, first of all, the intersectionality, because as much as we're talking about democracy and election, obviously there are so many things which are intersecting in the conversation around women and girls be part of these discussions and conversations, truly to have the aspirations and meaningful participation. So for us, for the way that we've been working is working in a partnership, in relationship, in collectiveness, with other women rights organizations, with other movements that are working with either women, with girls, with youth, which are either in political engagement directly, but others which are either doing the climate justice movement or feminist movement to ensure that the voices and the strength that is coming from different actors is really collected, and specifically during the time of election. And this has enabled us to understand the collectiveness and the power that still women harness in these campaigns, and demanding the collective and fairness in election processes. Issues such as sextortion and sexual violence, which do happen during campaigns and electoral processes, come out very strong through these different movements by having other movements which can support them, be that legal support, be that speaking out or speaking during the campaign for those who are in the campaign, asking questions, but also documenting those incidents which have the positive impact for the continuity of the movement and collectiveness, and those which continue to suppress the women positioning and women power when it comes to electoral processes. So I would really cement or solidifying the conversation around partnerships, but also understanding the narrative that the democratic spaces do take shape and do take spaces, as the first speaker spoke about authoritarianism and how in some locations those conversations cannot even see the end of the day. So in such spaces, how can still women movements and collective movements still show up, defend the rights, be present, and showcase what they're able to do without their voices being suppressed or being shut from the processes? So I know you mentioned the issue of the time, but I wish to maybe to state a little as a part of closing up. And for what I've seen, the youth movements and the changing use of technology, that has been another space that have ensured the voices which otherwise cannot be able to be heard outside can be heard in that another avenue. So to be in that space for those who are in rural area and those who are in peripherals of the cities, they should be a sort of connectivity and a bridge to ensure they're able to come out, to have those their voices to be heard, but to understand, because the other thing that is happening, those who do not have information, their participation is not equal to those who have information. So this conflicting agenda and narrative in different areas also had another wide range of inclusivity and connectivity in ensuring democratic processes do bring about all those who are not in the space at that particular time, but have a representation for their voices to be heard.
Thank you so much. Johnny, we're going to conclude this panel with you. We're talking, going back to when is a win a win. We've talked about some of those longer term processes, and you talked about ways in which organizations can identify when they have actually made progress. Are there ways that you've seen that organizations can design campaigns to assure that those kinds of wins will be deeper and more enduring?
Thanks, Laura. I think this picks up on Anna's point about what does transforming the state really look like. And when we think about representative democracy, participatory democracy, direct democracy, I think the challenge for really transforming the state in lasting ways involves how to create synergy between those different forms of expression of the popular will in specific places, in specific institutions, with specific social actors. And the question that comes up in our center, we're looking for colleagues who have experience, and we're talking with partners about how can mobilization from below shift the balance of forces within the state so that empowered allies within the state can open up more spaces from above, so there can be more mobilization from below, so there can be virtuous circles of mutual empowerment between insiders and outsiders. And specifically, how can those processes build people power institutions into the state so that they can last beyond the next elections? And specifically, how to construct participatory oversight institutions to be able to ensure that the state, with promises of change, can actually deliver on those changes in practice.
Well, I'm very pleased to see that we are now coming to the question and answer part. We promise there'll be interaction with the audience. There are a lot of comments, a lot of questions. Thank you so much for sending those in. So I'm going to go right ahead and pass it to Alexa Bradley to tell us what some of those comments and questions are.
Thank you, Laura. Of course, there's always more questions than we have time for, but they're all wonderful. I think a question that really comes through here, there's two that go together. Sandra, Anna, various of you have talked about the broader work of movements to create political subjects, to create a body, a citizenry, an active citizenry that is making bigger claims than any one election. So my question is really, what does it take to build a political subject or that kind of citizenry? And maybe this, I'll ask Anna or Sandra if you want to comment on that, and then, or Maria, any of the three of you that want to jump in on what that takes. And then I have a broader question, which is post-election, how do we sustain that political citizenry? Many people have commented in the chat, we win, and then the difficulty of actually sustaining gains or making headway given the other political realities in our context. So first, what does it take? And what is that work, that movement work of building that citizenry? And then how do we sustain it beyond elections, even if whether we've won or not? So let me pass that. Anna, do you want to jump in? And then Sandra or Maria, if you want to add, and then we'll go to the second part.
Thank you, Alexa. Thank you for the questions in the chat. How do we build political actors there? I think everyone is a political actor, but the very fact that of not wanting to participate or saying I am apolitical, that's a political position. And I think it's important to think in the long term of how to build organizations around political actors. I think it comes back to what we're talking about, the local work and political education, because often it isn't always a part of going to a political education school, but it's also within our neighborhoods, in the schools in which we're participating, the groups to which we belong, which apparently are apolitical, but there are ways of forming political actors. And I think also I wanted to comment on how political movements can dispute political space when we're talking about positions and agendas. And I think a lot of the political position is not to be afraid of acquiring power and knowing what to do, because I think the rightist and far rightist movements have an agenda for a long-term agenda and an international agenda in terms of how to gain power, what agendas to push, and how. And I think that a lot of that's part of the reason that it's been hard to stop that cycling. I think that we can create alliances beyond that, the local, and even reach it at an international level. In terms of political actors, it has to do with seeing them in positions of power and have a collective agenda to be able to reach and exercise power. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Now,
Sandra,
just
please.
to add to that, to what Anna was saying, to continue building and expanding political education and political practice, because citizenry carries out political practice, and even by entering into elected positions as part of it. How do you build the political practice? It is popular education, and I think that is basic to this. And also something, it's also being able to, we learn from the practice, we learn from reflection, and we learn from systematization of that practice and what the reality is presenting to us. And particularly in these terrible moments, such as when fundamentalism and fascism and all of these actions opposed to those of us who have been in this movement are gaining power. And just what Rosa was saying is what the power that's always been there at the community level is taking a greater leadership and being recognized in terms of its legitimacy. I think the legitimacy or legitimization is important in terms of political lessons, to recognize that we must recognize that we're taking power back. We have power, but the system has tried to teach us that we do not have it. But how are we going to exercise that power that we do indeed have? I think that's part of the political formation and the spaces that we create. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. I think that gives us such an important perspective on the larger work that we've been talking about that elections sit in. We only have a little bit of time, but I wanted to invite Jonathan and Maria to share a bit with us. And Rosa, if you're able to, I don't know, post-election. So we have perhaps a gain, a win somewhere in an electoral arena. And then we all know that there's often moments of great disappointment and the difficulty of actually advancing the agendas that we wanted to because of the other political realities, the other power dynamics. What is that work? How do we continue to mobilize ourselves and to both strengthen movements, but also impact those political arenas post-election? We'll go to you first, Jonathan, and Maria, if you want to jump in. After that, be great. Just a few minutes each.
Thank you. From a strategy point of view, I think the first point is that the kinds of strategies and tactics designed to get the most out of an electoral process are not necessarily going to be the same as the kinds of movement strategies and tactics needed to try to get the state to deliver. And that's the first point. And the second point is to come in with very realistic expectations that any kind of transformation of the state post-electoral is going to be limited, partial, subject to rollback, and is going to be a very long-term process. This is not a very catchy message to put on social media, but it does mean that the activists need to have realistic expectations, but also go beyond what some elected leaders might treat as a kind of trust me, I've got this approach, which we could talk about Mexico, but that's the approach that elected left leaders have taken there. Trust me, don't worry, we don't need people power to keep changes going. So we need to be aware of that as well. Thank you.
That's very helpful. And I think what you're also saying is that trust me thing is a demobilizing, right? You guys go home, we've got this. And where does that leave us? Maria, from your context, post-election, what do we need to be thinking about? What do we need to do?
Thank you. So I see that among the things that we need to think and do includes the issue of to reframe the struggles that goes beyond election. So what is it that we were positioning for as the movement, for instance? Is it a struggle for rights, justice, or accountability? What does that align with the whole context of election itself? But also to really develop a campaign which is very inclusive so that it can be able to follow up after the election itself. This including strengthen the internal organizations within the movement themselves. So as when the election really comes to an end, then we should continue what we say, the popular education, for instance, regular meetings, and not waiting during that campaigning period or during the election period to really have the civic education, which really comes in that big magnitude. While throughout the years, maybe 4 or 5 years, the case of Tanzania, 5 years, where the civic education is not as intense as during this particular time. But also, I think building community anchors, it's very important. These community leaders, the local communities, which we work and we are the election and campaigns really put a lot of efforts into them during the campaigns. So if we invest in these communities throughout the period, the grassroots, the livelihood project and solidarity fund, for instance, for them to be able to take forward not only during the campaign period, but after the period of the campaign and after the election, what is it their wins they had, and what are the gains they had, and what are the challenges they see through the process, and how did they learn through that process so they can be prepared in the next phase, and also having sort of a mentorship for the new generation to take up leadership and sort of a succession plan within the movement. And maybe because of the time, I'll say the other one is that documenting and reflecting those manifesto and the promises which they gave us. How do we and how much is really implemented, and what is that which is not implemented? Not just to the members of the parliament, but even through the winning parties who then goes to the parliament to do the budgeting and allocation of resources. How much is implemented and how much comes to the communities as it has been said during the campaign? And the last one I'll say, really to strengthen solidarity and alliances so that the momentum really does not phase out after the electoral processes, but even after the election, then we can be able to sustain our movement. But coming from the feminist movement, I truly believe also the issue of care and regeneration is very important, while taking collective all these other issues of monitoring and accounting our wins and our gains and challenges as well.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our speakers. So much rich material really about how we can see elections in a broader context of movement building wherever we are. And I think all of the 4 comments we just received really emphasize the necessity of strategies that go beyond, that precede and go beyond elections and have both the realism that Jonathan talked about, but also the bigger aspiration that you were talking about, Maria, like how do we understand the work in a bigger picture, a longer term set of strategies and aspirations. So thank you all so much. I hope people have the link now to download the report. If you haven't read it, you can get a lot more information there. Some of our speakers have also posted other links in the chat of interesting publications. Please check those out. And thank you again so much for joining us. And hopefully this will be helpful and feed your own work wherever you are. Thanks so much.
What's